Chapter 13. 5625. Sabrina dreamed again of the pink room and the painting of the sailboat, the white sail riding on the silver sea. If only she could turn. She was certain she would see what else was in the room. But no matter how her neck muscles strained, paralysis gripped her. Her eyes remained fixed on that picture until it melted away, the walls dissolving to a vision of the old city. Here the ancient residents were still living, adorned in their robes, belts, and shimmering trinkets. Melodious voices floated from the towers overhead, incense burned in shadowy alcoves, candles flickered in amber lamps. A bell tolled. Laughing, visiting, trading, worshipping, continued. The people oblivious to the ruin and wait for their coming generations. A scorched planet, a land of dust, a tomb of stone. A silver orb floating in metal darkness. A mother who has no mercy. A shrill beeping woke her. She sat up, panting as if she had been running, her hand instinctively on her blaster. When she caught her breath, she turned off the alarm on the visor and reached for her provision bag. It was nestled between the roots of a cypress tree, where she had wedged it to use as a pillow. Her cycle was parked alongside her to block the wind, the white wall of one of the abandoned settlement houses doing the same on her other side. It was an hour before sunrise, and the desert temperatures had plummeted. She wrapped herself in her uniform jacket before eating a breakfast of flatbread and preserves. She stared into the darkness of the nearest house while she chewed. The closest room was just a shell, the roof blown away by a bomb. Round craters the size of her fist scarred the walls where bullets had struck. The remaining parts of the house were intact, but she had no desire to enter. Even when the darkness had fallen the night before, she preferred to remain outside. The whispering sound of the breeze in the pine branches was definitely more soothing than what desiccated human remains might lie inside the buildings. Outside, with a spray of stars dimming overhead and a few sporadic bird chirps, she could forget the carnage from the war and understand the allure of this homestead perched amid orchards, where the laughter of children had once echoed between walls and bougainvillea waved in the breeze. But the children had been murdered too, along with so many others. She closed her bag and replaced it under the seat of the cycle. She used her natural vision to find her way back to the ridge. When she put her hand on a scorpion that had nested itself into the nook of a rock, she pulled down the visor to use her night vision. Its stinger had not pierced her glove, but the species was small and likely fatal. She crushed it under her boot. She crossed the spine of the ridge on her stomach, pulling herself along on her elbows, this time after a careful inspection of the ground for more scorpions. Once far enough down the hill, she took to her feet again, switching layers of readouts on her visor to study the fences in emerald night vision, as well as infrared. Guards were up and moving. So were a number of figures within the buildings. Her sensors could only penetrate the first 1 or 2 layers of walls, but it was enough to tell that the early risers were starting their shifts. Before the morning light could betray her, she rushed down the ridge, dodging and weaving between boulders and stumps that she had picked out the day before for cover. To her surprise, the new suit helped to steady her, its gyros and reinforced mesh responding, flexing, and contracting at various points around her body as she moved, keeping her from tumbling over when she began to lose her footing. As she dived headfirst into a gully alongside the fence, she made a mental note to kiss Moshe the next time she saw him. The suit anticipated her movements, supporting her body as she curled and rolled for cover. The fence was twice, almost 3 times as high here, compared to the entrance. Cutting it would set off alarms. So, with silent plea to Moshe that his ingenuity would continue to serve her, she jammed her feet into the gully face, took 2 steps, and jumped. The servos and flexors hummed as they powered to full strength. She focused on building enough torque to turn her body and move her center of gravity. The suit responded, and she rotated, stretched out, recumbent on the air at the peak of her leap, then descended on the other side. She caught herself in a somersault and rolled into a crouch. No sirens. No alarms. 2 kisses for Moshe, then. The canteen was her next target, and with the darkness lifting, she wasted no time running behind it to a row of outdoor toilets. They were locked for the night, but one of the handles broke off easily and she stepped inside. Strong chemicals used to keep the toilet sanitary made her dizzy. Her headset allowed her to eavesdrop on noises outside and within the main building. Doors opened and closed, footsteps crunched over gravel. A few terse good mornings, but still no alarms, no alerts regarding a trespasser. Just the running water of showers, the clink of plates in the dish room, and what sounded like a member of kitchen staff speaking to another member about the broken cooling element in a cold cube. She was safe. Now she waited. Whereas darkness had covered her entry, she would now use the daylight as she proceeded. She had picked a highly traveled area of the compound for her path to approach the main building. She hoped that an officer in a patrol suit, they had no way of telling she was a cadet, would not be out of place here. When the light through the vents of the toilet had grown bright enough, she stepped out. The canteen was closed, but she walked around it casually, even stopping when she reached the tables on the porch out front and searching the ground as if she had dropped something there the night before. A guard rounded the corner, patrolling the fence. After one look, he returned his attention to the perimeter. Her first test passed. She walked with increased confidence towards the main building. A flip of her visor told her there was a great deal of movement inside. All the better to be lost in, she thought. Without hesitating, she waved Derp's security pass before the sensor. The door clicked, and she entered. The air on the other side was cold. A long hallway stretched out in front of her with white walls and a polished blue floor. The walls were set far apart, as if to accommodate large numbers of prisoners. Black, glassy spheres set at intervals along the ceilings encased what she knew were security cameras. Doors on either side were also wide enough for a hospital bed to be rolled through. Spaced every few feet were alarm levers and speakers. Even more numerous were the locks set in the walls where a prisoner's chains could be secured. For a moment she worried that she was too early. The hallway was empty, but she started down its length anyway, aware that her safety depended on her looking as if she belonged. An orderly in white passed through the T-junction at the end of the hall, then disappeared from view. When two more passed, her hand floated to the empty sheath on her belt for her palm screen. She had left it with the cycle, but she wished she had it to bury her nose in now. The orderlies did not take much notice of her anyway. The patrol suit bought her passage, but wandering the halls was not telling her much, and it was only a matter of time before someone noticed her walking in circles. She decided to speak to the next person she saw. The opportunity came almost too soon. A man, not much older than she, emerged from a door on her right. He was tall and thin, his narrow wrists bearing a resemblance to the pens and styluses clicking loosely in the pocket of his lab coat. He wore a loose-fitting shirt and casual shoes with no socks, an outfit that Sabrina would have expected to see on someone down at the wharves on the 6th day. His beard was too thin to shave daily, but he had patchy fuzz on his chin and jaw. He stepped out of the door in a jaunty, relaxed manner, coming to a full stop when he saw her, his shoes making small squeaking noises against the highly polished floor. His eyes traveled up and down the length of her suit. "Can you help me?" Sabrina said with the same authoritative tone she would use on street patrol. "I'm supposed to have a tour of this place from Dr. Horowitz." The young man pulled at the corners of his mouth. "Dr. Horowitz is usually not in for another hour." "Well then, why'd Alex Derp tell me to come now?" She feigned growing anger. "Probably his idea of being funny." "You report to Derp?" "Yes, I'm Officer Zandy's fail," she said, taking the leap. Her status as a cadet could be taken away for that alone. "I'm filling in for him while he's on medical leave." "I've seen your name on a lot of forms." The man extended his hand. "I can show you around. I'm Dr. Lawrence Tripper, but you can call me Trip. Everyone here does." "I need to be out of here and on my way back to Fortinbras in 30 minutes, Trip," Sabrina said, refusing his hand, and instead checking the time on her visor, dispensing with common courtesies as she imagined Zandy's might. "Then let's get moving," he said, ignoring the slight. He opened the door he had just exited. "After you." Sabrina stepped into a room with rows of examination tables, each fitted with restraints for a patient's arms, legs, and head. At the head of each table, a hinged arm held a helmet, the inside bristling with electrodes. A half-dozen young workers were prepping syringes, filling them from bottles of fluid and setting them on metal trays beside the tables. Tripp introduced her to the others, sharing their names and how long they had been working there. Sabrina cut him off. I'm not interested in every orderly's work history. What happens on the tables?
Well,
Tripp said, his mouth twisting downward for a moment.
This is where the initial treatment takes place.
He casually flipped one of the thick belts.
The restraints are for the patient's own protection. They are injected with the necessary serums. It is standard to wait about an hour for the drugs to take their full effect and cross the blood-brain barrier. One of the side effects is increased anxiety, so patients are also injected with a sedative to calm them.
They must not be too sedated if they need the restraints.
Well, we find that too much sedation does the effect of the other compounds. We have to strike the right balance for the most effective treatment.
What is that hole for? She asked of the drain at the center of each table. Tripp shifted from one foot to another and tugged at the corners of his mouth again.
Well, many patients are still nervous during the procedure. It's not uncommon for one or two to lose control of their bladders.
Tripp's hand tapped the table soundlessly. Sabrina noticed the other staff glancing at her as they filled syringes. What exactly does the machine do to them? She asked.
It's the best possible solution to a challenging dilemma,
Tripp said, smiling.
Our wise founders have decreed that no subject is to be harmed. Yet, what do we do with a repeat offender, or even a scrit whose mind is already too far gone to ever recover, but still too dangerous to himself and to society to be released? The answer is the machine.
The question was, what does it do? Sabrina repeated. Tripp smiled.
It reduces neural density in the isocortex.
You seem to have a talent for saying a lot, but saying nothing, Doctor, she said, channeling Zandy's sour personality as best she could. How about an explanation for someone who captures criminals and does not treat them?
We wipe the memories clean.
Sabrina fought the urge to swallow. So they don't remember being a member of a cult, and they can just return to normal life.
Well, not exactly. Let me take you to the outside and introduce you to some of our residents who have undergone treatment.
He led her out of the processing room, and they entered a long hallway with identical doors on either side. Each door had a window, and Tripp urged her to look through one. On the other side were rows and rows of 3-tiered bunk beds, each with identical white sheets spread over sleeping bodies. Farther down the hallway, 2 guards led a line of residents out of a similar room. None were restrained. Each was dressed in identical sky-blue coveralls and cream undershirts. Men and women both had shaved heads.
See? There is no banging here,
Tripp said.
No screaming. No terror. It is nothing like the detention wing at the station.
He led her down the hallway, stopping them short of the row of residents marching out of the dormitory. They moved in an orderly line, each following in lockstep with the one in front. Their faces were placid, benign even, but hauntingly blank. The guards were relaxed, their sedation sticks stowed on their belts. When the last resident exited, Tripp and Sabrina followed them through a door leading outside. She blinked hard against the sunlight. Tripp's own features folded and creased as he grimaced in the glare. The residents moving in a straight line through a large field planted with legumes did not seem to take notice of the sun. They walked quickly beyond the freshly sprouting plants to an empty plot where 2 more orderlies waited with a suspensor lift full of picks and shovels. The residents took tools, then moved to an open spot where they began mechanically turning the soil, preparing it for planting. Throughout the entire process, no one spoke. Only the picks and shovels made a sound. It was clockwork, each resident's motions as efficient and precise as a machine. Even the rows of soil they turned were perfectly straight and perfectly spaced.
Memories are stored throughout the brain, so we can selectively remove them,
Tripp said, walking along a row of legumes.
Even if we could, who is to say they could return to their old life after being discovered as an occultist? Or, in the case of a scrit, they are usually so damaged we can't find out where they are from. They don't know, and we have no idea how they end up the way they do.
I thought prisoners and scrits were rehabilitated.
They are. But they are not returned to normal life,
Tripp said.
It's a common misperception. This is the best we can do for them.
He moved beside a female, bent to read the number printed on her back, and said,
6135. Stop.
The woman ceased shoveling and stood at attention, her shovel in her hand, and her eyes staring straight into the distance. She was older than Sabrina, with elegant features and delicate smile lines beside the corners of her mouth. Sabrina imagined her to be a school teacher for some reason, standing before a classroom of young students, the inspiration for more than a few schoolboy crushes. On a street in the city, with a head full of hair, she would have been striking. Tripp snapped his fingers before her face. Her eyes did not move.
See?
He said.
Reducing neural density in the isocortex blanks out their memories, their abstract thought, and along with it, curiosity, superstition, rebellion.
Their identities.
Well, yes. That is their punishment. For scrits, it is not as if they had any in the first place. They are reduced to living through their brainstems. We've increased their precision enough to preserve basic functions, like using a toilet, washing, and eating with utensils. Working keeps them active and healthy, and supplies us with more than enough food. The surplus is sent to the markets in the city.
Is the process reversible? Sabrina said. Her throat was dry, and her head felt light. She worked her heel into a mound of dirt in an effort to steady herself.
Oh no, we're safe. They are not going to wake up anytime soon. But look at this,
he said as he called over a male resident who dropped his pick and marched over as obedient as a pet dog. Tripp arranged the male and female so they were facing one another. He placed their hands in opposite positions on their shoulders and hips. Then in the middle of the field he started singing a wordless melody, slapping out a rhythm on his thigh. Immediately, with robotic precision, the two residents began to dance, stepping and turning in careful unison, kicking up a cloud of dust at their feet. Tripp flashed Sabrina a smile that was half bashful, half boastful.
One of our pastimes here is to see what we can teach them still. To see what skills can be established. This dance was my idea.
He started clapping, turning his back to her as he followed the residents while keeping his commentary running.
I had to keep it simple, though. There is not too much left upstairs to work with.
Sabrina looked away. Each one of Tripp's claps had felt like a blow to her head. She clenched and relaxed her fists. She scanned the fields and orchards. They seemed to stretch to the horizon, each filling with residents pouring from the buildings, marching out in obedient, efficient rows. One resident's face and build suddenly stood out to her. "Jacob?" she said. She trampled fresh rows of tilled soil as she ran to his side. He lifted and dropped his pick in unbroken rhythm. The markings, even the healing wounds on his arms, were unmistakable. "Please remember me. Please tell me they haven't yet." "Stop, Jacob. Stop. Jacob, stop," she said, touching his shoulder, trying to slow his relentless digging.
5625. Stop,
Tripp said, breathless after catching up to her. Jacob stopped. Sabrina stood before him. With her hand on his chest, she could feel his heart beating. "Jacob, it's me. Sabrina." Jacob was staring at her open-mouthed. She knew she must have looked a hysterical mess, but at the moment she did not care. She laughed aloud with relief when Jacob's eyes focused on her, and he smiled, but the expression slowly melted away, as if he was unable to maintain concentration. In another second, he was as blank as the other residents. Sabrina pounded his chest as if to wake him, but there was no response.
"You know him?"
Tripp said. She felt his eyes studying her with a cold, skeptical objectivity that reminded her of Dag. He seemed a particularly pathetic case. I brought him in from Hill 36. He sort of got to me, I guess. I wanted to know he was doing well." Even as she spoke, she knew she was losing credibility. Her hands were shaking on his chest, so she swung them around and clasped them behind her back. "He seemed to recognize me."
"Yes, interesting that,"
Tripp said, moving in front of Jacob. Jacob's eyes focused on him, and he smiled again, only to have it fade as it did for Sabrina.
"It's a reflex. Sometimes artifacts from the previous personality emerge like that. We focus on a face, we squint, we grimace, or we smile. He sees a face, he smiles. He must have been a friendly guy. He'll need some further treatment to get rid of it.
Sabrina did not hear Tripp as they walked back to the compound. Guilt, confusion, urgency roiled in her mind. She had to speak to Dag. He needed to know what was happening, immediately. She made some comment about having to leave, turning down Tripp's offer to introduce her to Dr. Horowitz. Every moment that passed now was one wasted. Cold air washed over them as they re-entered the building. She was vaguely aware of Tripp asking her when she would be taking over duties for Officer Derp, when two of the larger guards came around the corner striding towards them purposefully, their sedation sticks out. Tripp seemed to take notice of their posture and looked confused.
"Gentlemen, may I help you?"
The one on the right asked Sabrina to come with them. He had an athletic build, his broad shoulders tapering down to a narrow waist. The one on the left was older, with narrow eyes, a scarred, cruel face, and a large gut like Derp.
"She is from the detention facilities at the station," Tripp said. "I've been showing her around."
"I'd be happy to come along," Sabrina said with her best attempt at friendliness. This put Tripp at ease. "I was running behind this morning and did not see the sign-in at the front."
"Oh, well, that would explain it,"
Tripp began, but the two men had moved in close enough. Sabrina had already discreetly activated the grips on her hands and feet. She was outnumbered, but with the suit, and surprise, she had a chance to escape. She waited the span of 2 heartbeats, noting the way the 2 men moved. The closest was fluid, moving like an athlete. The second man was stiffer, favoring his right leg as if he had a cramp or congenital weakness. She breathed deep to relax her muscles as she would before a boxing match, even as the adrenaline made her limbs feel light and her heart race. Another breath. Aware of her entire body, she tried to lower her shoulders, even smile, hoping that it would persuade the men to let their guard down. The athlete reached out with his empty hand, his palm open, gesturing for her to move down the hallway in the direction they came from. The second man abruptly moved to the side, colliding with Tripp. The athlete's eyes darted at them. It was the break she wanted. Sabrina ran left and pushed the wall with her boots, gaining purchase even on the smoothly polished surface. She took advantage of their surprise, running up the wall, planting herself, then twisting to kick the back of the athlete's head. He dropped with a thud that shook the floor. Sabrina landed and immediately ducked the swing of the other's sedation stick. The grips on her gloves snagged his pants, and she swept his leg. Then she used the momentum to spin up while he fell down. Their places reversed. His head was bouncing off the floor when she smashed his face with her fist. 2 more guards sprinted around the corner. No element of surprise this time. She was not going to take them both on at once. She fired her grapple at one's ankle, winches in her shoulder and elbow spun as the man slid across the floor to her feet. She leapt him, landing a kick in his face. The 4th guard rushed her, but his sedation stick was leading out too far. She kicked the tip, caught its handle, and let the guard's own motion carry him into the charged end. A yellow stain spread on his white pants before he collapsed with the others. Tripp was reaching for the emergency signal on the wall, but Sabrina's blaster was already trained on him.
"It's not a stun. You're not Officer Fail, are you? What's in there?"
she said, darting her eyes to the nearest door.
"To textiles room. There will be residents. Sewing. That one? Empty. Storage. Open it. Drag them in."
Tripp obeyed, struggling with the weight of the men. When he had dragged in 2, she picked up the others, her suit providing additional strength, and tossed them. Blood and urine remained smeared across the floor. She wiped it up quickly with one of the guards' jackets. The storage room was filled with the reassuring sense of sterile medical gauze and adhesive tape. She threw a box of tape at Tripp's feet and told him to gag the guards. He was nothing if not obedient, wrapping their mouths thoroughly in layer after layer of tape. She removed prisoner restraints from her belt for him to lock their wrists and ankles.
"Now you,"
she said, turning him, locking his hands and feet, then ripping open a box of gauze. Her vision flashed red with each beat of her heart.
"Just wait until Dag hears about all this,"
she said, unrolling tape. Tripp turned his head, bewildered.
Dag, hear about this. But Dag trained us. He built this. He built everything.
Chapter 14. Grapple. Sabrina had pushed the cycle too hard. The polycarbon cover of the last battery was melting, the viscous liquid dripping through the frame of the cycle onto the street below. The drips traced Sabrina's path through Fortinbras, down closed streets, over construction barriers, against the legal flow of traffic. When the power finally died and the steering column of the cycle locked, Sabrina coasted down a hill until she reached the intersection of Bakanin and Avalos, where she leapt off, leaving the cycle to wobble into traffic. She was already halfway down the block when she heard a CRP crash into her riderless cycle. She didn't look back. The afternoon jams were just beginning. People were clogging the sidewalks, so she kept to the street where a pedal cyclist's shoulder hit her face as she collided with him, her momentum turning him end over end. She got up and kept running. She knew she ought to have a plan, but she could not think past simply getting Lindsey out of her cell and away from everything and everyone. Each person she passed on the street seemed to her a spy or an occultist. The very buildings loomed forward to trap her. Whom could she trust now? With every corner she rounded, she clenched her teeth with the fear of seeing a second prisoner transport, this one with Lindsey on it. She kept trying to force her mind to think ahead, just as she had done along every rise and every bend as she had raced back through the desert, but her thoughts kept returning to 3 facts. She had captured Lindsey. She had put her best friend in danger. Dag knew everything. All afternoon she had tried to invent possibilities where all the pieces fit together. Perhaps Dag had built the compound and trained the scientists, but an overly enthusiastic administrator, Dr. Horowitz, had turned the place into the nightmare it was now. As hard as she tried to convince herself, the thought that Dag would let anything escape his attention just did not sit with her. He knew. He has always known. The vehicle bay was busy. This time of afternoon, the station was at its fullest, as officers on the day shift parked their cruisers and cycles in charging ports, and their replacement officers dressed and prepped. Sabrina wiped her hair from her face as she crossed the bay, and slowed as much as her anxiety would allow. Detention crews in their white padded uniforms were loading a transport on the far end of the bay. Lindsey was not among them. Despite her haste, the expressions on the prisoners' faces stuck in her mind. Resignation, fear, loss. They knew. They knew, and Lindsey had known. Sabrina had been the ignorant one all this time. And Dag had kept her that way. The doors to the detention wing parted. Xandes sat behind the counter. Sabrina double-checked the cells with her visor. The infrared revealed figures behind her, each curled into similar frightened shapes. One of them was Lindsey. She flipped up the visor. Xandes' smiling visage awaited her. "Cadet Sabrina, how are you? That was some trick you played." She stopped when Sabrina raised her blaster to her face. She looked for some sense of cold determination within herself, but found none. The tremors in her hand were causing her weapon to shake. She was surprised at Xandes' calm, and how she simply stared back at Sabrina, and the gun that was pointed at her. "You know what this is?" Sabrina finally said. "I do," Xandes replied, standing up slowly, spreading her hands on the countertop, the artery in her neck throbbing. "But I want to give you a moment to reconsider." "You don't know what they do to them." "I do know what it is like to be a woman here, Sabrina. You do this, will always be seen as soft." Sabrina had not expected this. For her part, Xandes kept her hands still and her body straight. Only her eyes moved, glancing at the video screens behind her desk. "You have changed things for us. A week ago, I had given up the idea of being on patrol. Now it's a possibility. Don't ruin it. Don't ruin it for all of us. You can still put it away." Sabrina thumbed the blaster's discharge to a higher setting, a show of bravado that she didn't possess. Something in Xandes' face slammed shut. Her movements became swift and efficient as she led Sabrina to the detention block, her hands out to her sides in full view, a perfect study in the obedient prisoner. Sweat was pouring down Sabrina's sides and dripping off her forehead. She waited a safe distance behind while Xandes punched a code into a keypad that opened the door to the corridor where Lindsey was housed. Her cell was nearly at the end of the hall. Sabrina was aware with each step of the greater distance they would need to cover in their escape. The scrits screamed and pounded. This time, Xandes made no outraged cry for silence. When they finally reached Lindsey's cell, she did not hesitate to swipe her card and step inside. She crossed to the far corner and held up her hands. Sabrina followed her in slowly, but for a toilet anchored to the wall and a sink, the room was bare and empty. Opposite them was a sleeping mat where a figure lay trembling beneath a sheet. Lindsey's bells tinkled as she shook. Sabrina knelt down, placing her hand on her shoulder and calling Lindsey's name. When she did not respond, Sabrina rolled her onto her back and said her name again. Lindsey lifted her head and opened her eyes, then lost focus, her eyes rolling up in their sockets.
Please don't be like Jacob.
Sabrina swung her blaster back at Xandes.
What did you do to her?
She suffers from visual and auditory hallucinations. We adjusted her medication. It is a common treatment for those with her condition.
Adjusted?
20 times the normal dosage. It usually results in an increase of symptoms for about 24 hours, but when they subside, the patient is normally completely cured.
She turned to Lindsey, shaking her.
Lindsey! Lindsey, can you hear me?
Sabrina, Lindsey said, her speech slurred. Her hands tightened around Sabrina's arms.
I knew you were coming. We're going. She has a blaster.
Sabrina snapped her head around to see Xandes standing with her legs apart, a blaster in her hands.
Xandes, if you saw what they did,
Sabrina said.
I don't care,
Xandes said.
I gave you your chance. Now face the wall.
Sabrina's blaster was still in her hand, but she had lowered it when they had checked on Lindsey. Xandes had her. She repeated her command. Sabrina was turning to the wall when Lindsey began to speak. It was her distant voice, a whisper, the same voice she used when speaking from that place where her visions came.
You snapped the kittens' necks by a sewer, then dropped them in,
she said, the sibilant words echoing off the bare walls.
The first one went straight in, but the second, it dropped by the lip and rolled. I can see it too, through your eyes. That stayed with you the longest. How its body, the fur, soft, cushioning it so it barely made a sound. Body turning so loosely and relaxed down into nothingness. It was such a contrast to when they were alive. When they were alive and moved.
The whites in Xandes's eyes had grown large, and her body was as rigid as stone. Lindsey's eyes blinked rapidly as she fought to remain lucid. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edges of Sabrina's suit.
Xandes, Lindsey said, your parents gave you and your sister the kittens. Then your sister got sick and died, and you could not understand how they could have lived. Pets, animals, and your sister die. So you killed them both. Told your parents they had run away.
The barrel of the gun moved, and something strange began to happen to Xandes' face. It started with a deepening of the creases at the corner of her mouth, then spread to her neck, where her tendons corded. The muscles on her jaw bunched, and she shook her head back and forth.
Nobody knew. Nobody could know.
Her head nodded forward as if her breath had stopped. Finally, she shut her eyes and was racked by sobs. Her blaster clattered to the floor as she wrapped her arms around herself and dropped to her knees.
I was the pretty one,
she coughed.
She was the tough one.
She doubled over and touched her forehead to the floor. Sabrina swiped up her weapon and turned to grab Lindsey. Xandes crawled across the room, her hands slapping the bare floor before she grabbed Lindsey's gown in her fists.
Tell me she is in a better place. Please.
Lindsey did not respond. Upon standing, she had lost consciousness again, falling into Sabrina's arms. Sabrina struggled with her weight with one arm, while fending Xandy's off with the other. She pried the prison guard's fingers loose, no longer able to bring herself to shoot her, even with a stun. In the corridor, Sabrina could barely hear the screams and moans of the other prisoners over the rush of blood in her ears. Lindsey woke and made token motions with her legs as if walking, but that only slowed them further. Halfway down the hall, Sabrina threw her over her shoulder and began to run, stopping when they reached the door at the end of the corridor. It was locked. Sabrina tried Derp's pass, but it had been deactivated. Sabrina was lifting her blaster to the keypad when Lindsey's eyes snapped open. 425896771. Sabrina punched the code in, and a green light flashed just before the door slid open.
How did you know?
I just see everything. I looked at the keypad, and I could see all the times those numbers had been punched. I could see all the people brought through the door. I can see them when they come here looking for us in a few minutes. I can't make it stop. Sabrina carried Lindsey past the admissions desk and walked toward the hall that led to the vehicle bay, her weapon drawn. Lindsey hissed. Left, through that door. That's not the way to the... Do it! They're coming! Sabrina pushed open the door to a storage closet. Footsteps sounded behind them. She flung Lindsey in ahead of her and swung the door closed, leaving it open just a crack behind them. 2 officers passed. As Sabrina pushed open the door again, Lindsey shuddered and whispered, "Wait, one more." On cue, a 3rd officer ran past. "It's all right. Go," Lindsey said from the back of the closet. "You can see them coming?" "Yes. Hurry." Lindsey turned them down 2 more hallways. They were not the turns Sabrina would have taken to the vehicle bay, but each time they narrowly avoided officers or detention guards. While they waited in a hallway for a delivery boy to turn the corner, Lindsey mumbled, "They know." "They know what?" "That you betrayed them." A siren pierced the air above them, sounding throughout the building, announcing a detention breach. A voice crackled in Sabrina's earpiece, announcing that Cadet Sabria had just assaulted an officer and was trying to escape with a prisoner. Then it went dead. They had cut her off from the network. "Crite!" Sabrina said, remembering what they did to criminals who assault officers, and wondering how much worse it would be for a cadet. "Turn now." "What?" "Turn now. Right." Sabrina obeyed, pulling them down a narrow corridor lined with windowless offices, each closed and locked. It was a hallway she had never seen before, and one she never would have taken. Sabrina hefted her up to her shoulder. Lindsey's muscles still had a relaxed, rubbery quality to them. They proceeded on a circuitous route through the station, each turn allowing them to elude officers on their way to the detention wing. The end of the hall opened into a wing of the station under construction. They passed between piles of building materials, idle construction machinery, and through curtains of plastic sheeting. Footsteps pounded the floor above and below, but the hallway on this floor was empty. "Down the stairs, fast," Lindsey said. Sabrina kicked open a door to a nearby stairwell, her feet flying from one step to the other as she descended onto a floor that smelled of fresh paint. "Through the door. Shoot from left to right." Sabrina opened the door with her shoulder and charged through, weapon raised. She was in one of the new teaching wings on the station. Classrooms lined the corridor. 3 figures came running around the corner simultaneously. Pitt, Boyle, and Abner halted upon seeing her, bumping into the other. Abner, on the left, had his own weapon raised to his shoulder like a good cadet. Sabrina stunned him first, then Boyle, who was quick enough to draw his blaster, but not quick enough to aim it. Pitt knew better than to waste time arming himself. He stepped to his left, avoiding Sabrina's blast, then closed in with 2 quick steps. His left hand swept downward to his belt, powering up his suit, while his right struck Sabrina's blaster hard enough to send it across the floor. He leaned back and kicked her, his heavy foot knocking her against the wall. Lindsey slipped from her shoulder with a cry. Sabrina raised her fists. She had beaten instructors in the ring, and with her suit on she had added speed, power, and protection. She was as confident boxing as she was shooting. But Pitt knew this, too. She punched twice. He blocked one with his forearm, The other landed on his side, but his suit protected him. He lowered his shoulder and drove her against the wall. Spots danced in front of her eyes as she realized her miscalculation. As one of the grappling instructors, Pitt knew her strengths and weaknesses. She was at a disadvantage grappling where size mattered. He had just shifted the advantage to himself. She struck downward at his collarbones, but she might as well have been hitting sandbags. She swung for his head. He ducked, and while low to the ground, his hand clamped around her ankle. The next moment, the room was spinning as he swung her upside down. He pitched her into the wall. His suit augmented his strength just as Sabrina's protected her, absorbing some of the impact as the bricks shattered beneath her. Her legs and arms felt heavy and stiff as she tried to get up. Pitt was on her again, tossing her up into the ceiling. The hall went dark as the lights shattered. Glass and wiring dropped to the floor. Sabrina had barely made it to her elbows before Pitt grabbed her shoulders, swung her in a tight circle, and released her. Time slowed as she flailed, suspended in the air, before she crashed through a glass window and tumbled across the rows of seating in an unopened classroom. Pain suffused her body. She could not see Lindsey now as she struggled to extricate herself from the desks and chairs that still smelled of new fabric and paint. Pitt had flung her through one of the observation windows where instructors could monitor students while taking exams. Now he was kicking at the locked door. Sabrina scrambled for the window, but her head was spinning, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. The door burst open. Pitt stretched out and caught her by the leg. She spun and swung for his face, but she was too slow. He grabbed her by the belt and flung her down on a desk. He did not leave time for her to recover. He yanked her up and slammed her onto the desk again. Her shoulders and back felt as if they would splinter to pieces. Pitt lifted her above his head once more and drove her for a third time into the desktop. This time it cracked and collapsed. Sabrina tasted blood in her mouth as she tried to rise. Pitt curled an arm around her hips and threw her end over end into the corner of the room. She lay where she had slid down the wall, a shard of the desk she had managed to grab, brandished in her hand. When Pitt came in again, she stabbed him, but the wood simply splintered against the mesh of his suit. He grabbed her neck now, the adhesive grips of his gloves activating and tearing at her skin. Her feet were off the ground, and he began to clamp down with irresistible pressure. Spit gathered on his lips as he spoke through clenched teeth.
"Now you learn your place."
Sabrina's breath wheezed in her throat. The room darkened. Her swipes at Pitt were useless. She had one option left. She aimed her grapple at the exposed flesh of Pitt's neck, but he anticipated her and struck her wrist. The grapple fired wide, the line whizzing over his shoulder. A smile crept into the corner of his mouth.
"Would have killed me, shooting that into me. That's all the justification I need."
The pressure around her neck increased. Her sight was failing her, but something punched through the growing hood of unconsciousness. A sensation in her fingertips as electrodes in the derm links of her gloves relayed messages through her nerve endings to her brain. Her grapple had locked onto something. Her last thoughts before oblivion took her was simply retract. In the new suit, a mere thought was enough. Her arm pulled straight. The winches sprung to life and dragged some object across the floor with a loud screech. A desk slammed into the back of Pitt's knees, dropping him against its top. He released Sabrina. She gasped, snapping off one of the desk legs as she hit the floor. The broken desk tipped, dumping Pitt. He sprung up just in time for Sabrina to connect. The first strike stunned him, snapping his head sideways. As he wobbled, Sabrina wound up and swung again. This time the desk leg broke off in her hand, and pieces struck the wall along with a string of Pitt's blood. He fell with a heavy thud alongside the wreckage of the destroyed classroom. Only a few inches of the leg remained. She threw the piece on Pitt's motionless body and limped outside through the door Pitt had shattered. Boyle and Abner were still unconscious, left where she had stunned them. Lindsey was slumped against the wall, like a paraplegic dumped from her wheelchair.
"Sabrina, you're bleeding,"
she said as Sabrina helped her up.
"Not as bad as Pitt. Let's go."
Chapter 15. Annalise. Boyle and Abner were unconscious but still alive. Sabrina ripped off Boyle's headset and visor and put them on. She could hear the chatter of officers searching the floors of the station. Superimposed on her vision was a map of the station, the secured wings glowing blue. She quickly punched in a message that their wing was locked down. She knew the station security would try to track her own headset, so she removed its power source. She could use Boyle's now, and she took Abner's for good measure. Lindsey's directions had served them well. They were adjacent to the vehicle bay, and an unfinished wall allowed them to slip through to a charging cruiser. The batteries would be low, but the methylene tanks were full. Sabrina belted Lindsey in as her eyes rolled back again.
Come on, stay with me, Lindsey.
Sabrina, I see darkness, full of light. Broken pieces of light and stone.
Sabrina ducked behind the fender as two cadets ran past. Once they were gone, she unhitched the cruiser from the charging post and climbed into the driver's seat. She rolled down the rows of parked vehicles slowly, as any cruiser on its way out to patrol would do. With all the commotion, there was no one watching the ramp as Sabrina pulled the vehicle up and entered the flow of traffic. She waited until they turned the corner off Avalos Street before she stopped, replaced the power source in her own headset, got out, and tossed it into the back of a passing vegetable lorry. She gave Abner's to a boy on a pedal cycle, telling him he could only have it if he rode away from her as fast as he could. He disappeared around the corner, his legs pumping madly. She got back in, slammed her foot down on the pedal, and started the siren wailing. It was not long before she passed other cruisers speeding in the opposite direction, responding to urgent calls back at the station. She felt protected by the mirrored windows, but she knew it was not long before they figured out her trick. Lindsey grabbed her arm. Tears were running down her face.
I'm sorry. I never knew.
Never knew what?
After you beat up Sylvia at school. They made you clean the toilets for a month at recess. They didn't even give you gloves.
Sabrina smiled for the first time that day. I never wanted you to know. I did not want you to feel guilty. I'd do it again, for you. Lindsey held her hand until she passed out again. Sabrina put Lindsey's hand in her lap and put both hands back on the wheel. She swung the vehicle around onto Mills Street, dodging and weaving around pedestrians and crosswalks. Once she passed through Kynes Circle and was on the Bay Road, she yanked the power lever, shifting propulsion from the cruiser's batteries to the methylene turbines. The engines roared to life, and she and Lindsey were thrown against their seats. Long and wedge-shaped, the cruisers were built to be the fastest vehicles on the road. CRPs flew past as if they were stationary. But Sabrina did not know where she was driving. Her only thought had been to escape the city. Now where would they go? The head ministry where Dag waited? Never. North was impossible. The lands beyond Lysander were uninhabitable with radiation. She knew there were empty lands to the south between the edges of the city and the wall, but what chance did the two of them stand in the wilderness? Voices in her ear had determined that the locating beacon from her headset in the vegetable lorry was a decoy. The same with Abner's. Time was running out. She watched the fuel and temperature gauges on the instrument panel of the cruiser. Their speed was slowly charging the batteries. When she lifted the lid on the supply box at their feet, she saw it was full. Each cruiser had at least 3 days of food and water, as well as thermal blankets.
3 days.
Then what?
There were people here once,
Lindsey said, pressing her hand to the window, brown lands running past her fingers. What people?
People sent away. Then others came. They called it home. They had lost so much. It was so sad. So much pain.
Sabrina rubbed the wheel with her thumb, wondering how strong a dose they had given Lindsey. She pictured Jacob and his flat, dead-eyed stare. Her thumbnail peeled off a piece of the steering wheel grip as Lindsey began to drift away again. Lindsey, stay with me. The turn to the head ministry approached on their left and disappeared. They were rolling down a road Sabrina had traveled with her uncle only a few times, when he had taken her with him to visit orchards and fields managed by the ministry. Wind blew in from the sea and sent curtains of sand across their path and over the cruiser in long, curling eddies. A black shape metastasized outside Sabrina's window, a shape that screamed like a child. A barrage of green light flooded the cockpit of the car. An Elved. A white number 3 stood out against the black exoskeleton. The Elved's turbines were whining at full blast, twin cones of blue flame rippling, the ailerons tipping and turning with small adjustments as the machine tried to identify her and Lindsey. Sabrina slapped down her visor before the beams traced her face, buying her a few moments to power down the window. The heat of the desert and the Elved engines poured over her like a furnace. She suppressed a cough in her throat. Her skin was suddenly flush with sweat. The noise and heat woke Lindsey, her eyes growing wide at the sight of the machine so close. The Elved rocked in the vortexes thrown off by the cruiser, the plating and limbs rearranging as it sought a more aerodynamic configuration. The chrome struts that connected the turbines to the body gleamed as they extended, one segment telescoping into another. Sabrina depressed the blaster setting to its most lethal, took aim out the window, and fired. A blue arc danced and dissipated as currents shorted out in the machine. The stabilizing surfaces of the wings froze, and the Elved's body tipped downward, dragging along the road. A rooster tail of sparks erupted and road fragments pinged at the side of the vehicle. The starboard thruster choked in a gush of exhaust. The pitch of the remaining engine crescendoed as the Elved compensated for the sudden loss of power and leveled out. "Hold on," Sabrina said. She yanked the wheel and slammed the cruiser into the Elved. The vehicle rocked as warnings and alarms screamed. Lindsey braced herself against the dashboard as Sabrina righted the wheel, and the Elved tumbled alongside like a cannonball. After bouncing a few more times, it rolled off to the shoulder in a cloud of dust and smoke. Sabrina tried to see the machine in the side view mirror, but it had been sheared off in the collision. "Where did it go?" "Behind us," Lindsey said. The noise of the thruster at full blast closed in on them. The cruiser lurched forward, the bottom scraping the road. "It's trying to tear off our thruster," Sabrina said. She struggled against the forces in the wheel as the Elved tore the covers of the engine away. Her blaster on its highest setting, she fired a volley of shots out the back, blowing out the window. The shaking of the wheel brought her attention back to the road. She had strayed onto the shoulder, and a sign smacked against the windscreen and tumbled over them, before she pulled back onto the road. The Elved closed in on the cruiser's thrusters again, one of its limbs converted into a grasping claw. A warning on the dash indicated that pressure in the propulsion system was dropping. One of the injection cylinders was already offline. Straightening the vehicle, Sabrina checked Lindsey's seatbelt, then her own, before standing on the brake pedal. They were flung against their belts. The inside of the cruiser exploded with the impact of the Elved, striking against the frame behind, then again on the nose of the cruiser as it tumbled end over end. It was in front of them, rolling, a mess of flashing sunlight and creaking metal. A drunken man. The machine tried to arrest its momentum, dropping an arm that had morphed into a grapple. "No, you don't," Sabrina said. She punched the accelerator, training the center of the cruiser on the machine as it struggled to stand upright. "Duck! Blade!" Lindsey pulled Sabrina down across the seats. Another crash, another thumping against the roof of the vehicle. This time, when Sabrina sat up, the wind blew through her hair. When she leaned back, she found that the top of her seat had been shorn away, along with the top of the windscreen and the rearview mirror. She turned in her seat to see the number 3 Elved attempting to stand up again. The top of the cruiser lay on the road like the top of a tin can. The Elved was listing to one side, but the limb reshaped into a long, sword-like blade was unmistakable. "I guess I made him angry," Sabrina said, righting the wheel before the cruiser rolled off the road. She thought she had seen flashing blue lights on the road behind the Elved, but before she could turn and look again, Lindsey was screaming. "Another! From the sky!" A second Elved was descending onto the road, thrusters burning bright blue. Prey. Running out of options. The number on its shoulder identified it as 5. It lifted an arm, and the air around it shimmered like a mirage in sunlight. Sabrina recognized the edges of the expanding bubble before moving towards them. "Itza!" she spat. The sound pulse grew, invisible but for the edge where the powerful mix of high and low frequency waves blurred the light. It was a pure pulse of sound that would shatter anything inflexible. The cruiser, leaving them shaken to the point of sickness but physically intact. As intact as they could be when the cruiser disintegrated around them at top speed. The bubble soon engulfed the entire road, distorting the image of the Elved beyond to make the number 5 seem much smaller. Dust and particles from the road were gathering in a wave at the base. An access road was coming up on their left, and Sabrina swung the cruiser in that direction, turning them broadside to the wave. It struck the back half of the vehicle in a loud whoomp that knocked the air out of her chest. The turbines went tumbling into the hardpan, disintegrating into their component parts with each cartwheel. Battery power took over as Sabrina crashed them into a dirt road, spinning the front tires and dragging what was left of the back of the cruiser along the ground. The front of the cruiser was smoking as they powered up the road, the sound of sirens in pursuit behind them. A whole line of vehicles with flashing lights filled the road to the north. Number 5 was tracking them on the ground, following at a cautious pace. Number 3 was nowhere to be seen. The road ended outside a tall, windowless building, an automated water processing facility. Sabrina spent the last dregs of power from the battery to pull them up as close to the front door as possible. Lindsey got out on her own accord, leaning on the cruiser frame for support, her eyes wide at the empty space where the back of the vehicle had been.
"You came here with Dag once,"
she said, panting, her eyes blinking as if trying to sort out the image she saw in her mind with the one presented by her eyes.
"Yes,"
Sabrina said, checking over her shoulder at number 5 stalking through the brush towards them.
"It was an inspection trip."
The weapons locker on the left side of the vehicle had been damaged but not destroyed. She emptied it of its contents: a plasma rifle, sonic detonators, sedation sticks. She used the plasma rifle to blow open the door to the building. Before number 5 came any closer, she grabbed a satchel of sonic detonators in one hand and Lindsey with the other. Once inside, Sabrina blocked the door by overturning a cart of spare pipes and valves. Over the clamor, she could just hear a voice calling out to her on a loudspeaker from one of the vehicles pulling up outside. Machinery hummed softly all around them. The air was heavy and warm with moisture.
"He is out there,"
Lindsey announced, leaning against a sweating pipe.
"Who?"
"Your uncle."
"Got any other ideas about how we get out of here?"
"No, but I know you once kissed Doug Nichols."
"Had onion breath. I didn't tell you."
Sabrina headed towards a set of metal stairs.
"But that is not going to help us. Can't you dream up a scenario to take on 100 officers?"
Lindsey shook her head.
"It doesn't work that way. Things are just coming to me in flashes. It's like whoever or whatever's in front of me. I see their past, their future."
An animal instinct was driving Sabrina upward. She took Lindsey by the hand and led her up the staircase, which connected to a series of catwalks. They crossed cisterns of dark water. At every opportunity, Sabrina took them higher, the air warming and filling with the smell of steam, charcoal, and sand. They both were breathing heavily from the climb, the gentle noise of humming machines and trickling water strangely soothing. As they caught their breath on a landing, Lindsey stiffened.
"The door! They're about to—"
A deafening sound drowned out the pumps and reverberated throughout the plant. The echoes faded and were replaced by the drumbeat and rattle of feet climbing the stairs.
"Come on,"
Sabrina said, grabbing Lindsey's hand again. Lindsey struggled, nearly losing her balance over a railing. Sabrina caught her. Officers sprinted across the plant's floor several stories below. She wrapped her arm around Lindsey again as an officer grappled and winched himself up to the end of the catwalk behind him. She turned her blaster on him, but before she could fire, Dag's voice called out from below.
"Don't shoot! Hold your fire!"
The officer's blaster was trained on her, but his trigger finger did not move. Sabrina started up another set of stairs, the catwalk shaking now with the pounding of so many climbing feet. Grappling hooks lodged in the struts and joists of the catwalks and wound more officers upward. Another officer appeared a level below them, peering through a dark visor. She felt a disturbing sympathy for every scrit, occultist, and petty criminal she had ever chased down.
"So this is how we look. Impervious. Cold."
Her uncle continued to beseech everyone to hold their fire. They all must have known her identity by now, her real identity, her secret revealed in her uncle's own wild pursuit, his strained pleas. How they must have hated her. But if it kept them from firing, she would take advantage of it. She helped Lindsey up a last set of stairs that climbed between two fat, bulging cisterns and through a door to the roof. There was nowhere else to go. She did not bother closing the latch behind them. It was no use, and Sabrina was too weary from carrying Lindsey. Her motions had to be simple and efficient now. The roof was covered with shimmering pools, water pumped up from below and undulating large patches of algae. They negotiated the narrow walks that formed a grid between the pools, while officers poured out the hatch, slowly cutting off one avenue of escape after another. Sabrina simply reacted now. She had no plan, except to move in the direction away from the officers. Pray. Cornered. The remaining catwalks led her to the far end of the building, where a large channel sluiced excess water from the pools down the side of the building and to an inlet where the sea churned between sheer cliffs. The sun, resting on the eastern horizon, turned the water a fire red. A scream and a grinding tore the air as Number 5 circled overhead, then alighted, the talons curling around the metal skeleton of the building like a raptor. The walks were swarming with armed officers now, each identical in their patrol suits. Did she know any of them? She had to. The catwalks ended, and she stepped into the channel of running water that rose to her shins. Below the lip of the channel, she was out of sight of the officers. The water was warm from collecting in the sunlight. While they were hidden from sight, Sabrina dropped a sonic detonator charge into the flow, armed it, and held it against the current with her foot. As officers appeared at the end of the channel, she backed towards the edge with Lindsey in one arm and the detonator beneath her boot. The Elved circled and landed in a new position, gazing down at her through its impenetrable convex face. Then Dag was there. By all appearances, the wrinkled slacks, the unbuttoned shirt damp with sweat, he had been ripped from his work by the unfolding situation. How she had humiliated him. Their great leader. His personal life displayed so openly before his subjects. His complete lack of control. His disheveled state. Sabrina could not determine what she felt when she looked at him. It was better to see him than the weapons aimed at her. But at the same time, all he represented to her was betrayal. He splashed into the water.
Sabrina, please, stop this. I've seen what they do, Dag.
She raised her gun at him.
I've seen what they do. Tell me you didn't know.
He lifted his hands, palms outward, and shook his head.
Sabrina, I should have told you. How could you let it happen to her?
Sabrina said, wrapping her arm more tightly around Lindsey, continuing to back down the sluice of water as her uncle followed gingerly, slipping once to his knees, then righting himself. Officers dropped into the water behind him, fanning out into a line. Sabrina checked over her shoulder to make sure no one was circling back behind her.
Please, I can explain everything. It is my own fault I have not shared the entire truth with you.
Dag pleaded, his face etched with worry. Lindsey stiffened in Sabrina's arm and shook as another tremor took her. The spell did not last long, but when she came out of it, Lindsey clung to Sabrina more tightly than before, her nails scratching against the mesh of Sabrina's suit. She looked back and forth between Dag and Sabrina, her eyes full of poison.
How could you do that to her?
She said between her teeth, her arms tightening around Sabrina. Something Sabrina had never seen appeared in Dag's face. Fear. He stepped towards them, only to slip again in the water to his knees. He tried to steady himself, waving his arms.
Lindsey, don't!
He killed your parents, Sabrina! The water swirling at their feet seemed to grow stronger. A tern wailed and tipped against a landscape of red clouds. Water thrown up by the disrupted current gathered in gleaming drops like quicksilver on the beams of the building, beams where in places the paint had blistered beneath spreading scabs of rust. Lindsey steadied Sabrina now. They had reached the edge of the channel, and ocean waves crashed in an inlet far below them. The buzz of locusts rose from a grassy ledge below. Sabrina felt completely hollow, her insides scooped away, and what was left of her, only a thin residue clinging to a dying, empty shell. She knew the only reason she could stand on those hollow columns that were once her legs was Lindsey, straining against the current to support her own dead weight. Dag's hand was wrapped around his middle, as if he had been kicked, his lips pale and trembling.
Sabrina, there is so much you don't understand.
She used the hollow limb that used to be her arm to point the gun directly at her uncle's face.
Tell me the whole truth.
He kept to one knee but steadied himself with the other leg bent, reaching his hands out to her.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I had no choice.
She nearly shot him, but Lindsey stayed her for whatever reason, placing her hand on her hollow forearm. Tears were blinding her now. The Elved, the officers, the shining sun, all working into a blur. She fought Lindsey, lifting the gun again. Dag was motionless, staring blankly at her, his mouth, his cheeks, his jaw sagging. She heard pleading sounds from Lindsey, but not the words. Her own voice came out in a whisper, the question driven by some seed of doubt placed there so long before, germinating only now. "What is my real name, Dag?" The answer seemed to come to mind as soon as the word left his lips, as if it was a puzzle piece she already knew by the shape of its absence. "Annalise." The only sound was the water rushing past. Every weapon remained aimed in their direction. Sabrina lowered her own, but did not let go, lest the officers rush forward. "Dag," she said, wrapping her free arm around Lindsey. Lindsey seemed to understand. She took hold of Sabrina's belt with both hands and pressed herself close. "Promise me something." "Anything." "Don't try to follow us." Before he could answer, Sabrina lifted her foot off the sonic charge and threw herself and Lindsey over the edge. They fell in a curtain of suspended water before the whoomp of thunder exploded. The railings and skin of the treatment plant twisted free into the air, pliable as ribbon. Then the shock waves struck them, sending them down, faster, farther, arm in arm, into the waiting sea.